police insulted Barron Trump on a highway, but when he discovered the truth, it changed everything. It was a bright, clear morning, and the scenic highway stretched out like a ribbon between rolling green hills. The hum of Barron Trump's modest car was the only sound accompanying him as he drove along the peaceful route. The sun bathed the road in a golden glow, casting shadows of trees that sway gently in the breeze. It was the kind of day that invited reflection and a brief escape from the busyness of life. Barron, casually dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, gripped the steering wheel with a relaxed posture. His eyes were focused on the road ahead, but his mind wandered. At just 19 years old, the youngest son of a former president, he had grown up under the relentless gaze of the public eye. Every move he made seemed to invite scrutiny, every word analyzed and debated. Today, however, was different. The quiet road offered him a rare moment of solitude, far removed from the high-pressure world he was used to. There were no cameras, no events, and no security detail shadowing his every step, just the open road and the promise of a peaceful drive. Barron had always valued moments like this. They gave him the chance to step away from the expectations that came with his name and to simply be himself. As he glanced at the picturesque landscape around him, a small smile touched his lips. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down, offering him a sense of freedom he rarely experienced. Little did he know, this quiet drive would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would test his character and remind him of the profound impact of even the smallest actions. The hum of the car engine and the whisper of the wind through the open windows filled the air as Barron Trump continued his peaceful drive. The sunlight danced on the windshield, and the quiet of the scenic highway was a welcome break from the world's noise. He adjusted his rearview mirror absent-mindedly, his thoughts drifting far away. Then, out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights flooded his rearview mirror. The peaceful moment shattered. Barron's brow furrowed in confusion as he eased his car to the side of the road. He hadn't been speeding, and his car wasn't flashy enough to draw attention. What could this be about? The tires crunched against the gravel shoulder as he came to a stop. Rolling down his window, Barron waited, hands resting visibly on the steering wheel, just as he'd been taught. The officer stepped out of the patrol car and approached. His footsteps were firm, his posture tense. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the calm morning air. Barron handed over the documents without a word. He glanced at the officer, whose face was etched with suspicion. "Is there a problem, Officer?" Barron asked, his tone polite but tinged with curiosity. The officer studied him for a moment before leaning in slightly, his gaze unwavering. "What do you think you're doing out here?" he snapped. "Kids like you, thinking you own the road because of your name or your fancy car." Barron blinked, stunned by the hostility. His car was modest, and his demeanor had been nothing but respectful. "I'm not sure I understand," he replied evenly, trying to keep his voice calm. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't play innocent with me," he said, his tone accusatory. "People like you think you're untouchable. You think your last name gives you a free pass." The word stung, but Barron didn't let it show. Years of being in the public eye had taught him how to handle baseless accusations. "I'm just driving," he said calmly. "I haven't broken any laws." The officer scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Driving," he muttered, shaking his head. "Probably showing off, trying to look important." Barron bit back the urge to defend himself more strongly. He knew escalating the situation wouldn't help. Instead, he kept his tone steady. "If I've done something wrong, I'd like to understand." but the officer didn't seem interested in explaining. His focus shifted momentarily, his eyes flicking toward the side of the road. Barron followed his gaze and spotted something, or rather, someone. A woman stood a few yards away, partially obscured by the officer's patrol car. She clutched a piece of paper in her trembling hands, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked utterly lost. Barron's concern deepened. "Is she okay?" he asked, nodding toward the woman. The officer's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business," he said curtly. "Stay in your car." But Barron couldn't ignore the woman's distress. He glanced back at the officer, his expression resolute. "She looks like she needs help," he said, his voice firmer now. The officer shifted uncomfortably, the confident edge in his voice beginning to waver. "It's under control," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. Barron didn't budge. Something about the situation didn't feel right. The woman's fear was palpable, and the officer's demeanor seemed unusually defensive. Against his better judgment and the officer's orders, Barron opened his car door and stepped out. "Hey!" the officer barked. "I said stay in the car." But Barron was already moving, his steps deliberate and calm. He approached the woman slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am," he said gently, his voice carrying over the tension-filled air. "Are you okay?" The woman's wide eyes met his, and for a moment, she looked like she might crumble. Then, hesitantly, she held out the crumpled piece of paper. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You need to see this." Barron took the note carefully, his heart pounding as he unfolded it. The officer shouted behind him, his tone frantic now. "I told you to back off." But Barron's attention was fully on the paper in his hands. As his eyes scanned the words, the gravity of the situation hit him like a tidal wave. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low but firm, turning to the officer. "Did you know about this?" The officer's face turned red, his posture stiffening. "You don't understand," he began, but Barron cut him off. "I understand enough," Barron said, his calm demeanor giving way to a quiet fury. "And this isn't right." The tension reached a breaking point as Barron realized that what had begun as an unwarranted stop on the highway had uncovered something much deeper and far more urgent. Barron's gaze shifted from the officer to the woman standing a few yards away. She looked out of place, fragile, and deeply distressed. Clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands, her figure seemed weighed down by something more than just the chilly morning breeze. Her disheveled appearance, a loose sweater hanging on her thin frame and mismatched shoes, told a silent story of hardship and pain. "Is she okay?" Barron asked, his voice calm but filled with genuine concern. The officer stiffened, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the woman. "She's fine," he snapped, his tone dismissive. "None of your business. Just stay out of it." Barron's brow furrowed. Something didn't feel right. The officer's sharp tone and the woman's visible distress were at odds, raising questions he couldn't ignore. "I think she needs help," Barron pressed gently. The officer's face hardened, his posture growing defensive. "I said it's under control," he barked, his voice louder now, as if trying to assert authority over the situation. But Barron wasn't one to be easily deterred. He had grown up in a world where appearances often masked deeper truths, and his instincts told him there was more to this than the officer was letting on. Without another word, he opened his car door and stepped out. "Hey!" the officer shouted, taking a step toward him. "I told you to stay in the car." Barron ignored the command, walking toward the woman with measured steps. His calm demeanor seemed to contrast sharply with the tension in the air. "Ma'am," he called softly as he approached her. "Are you okay?" The woman's eyes darted toward him, wide and glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt, but then she hesitated, clutching the paper even tighter. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do." Barron stopped a few feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. "It's all right," he said, his voice gentle and reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." The woman hesitated again, glancing nervously at the officer, who stood rigid and visibly uncomfortable. "Please," she finally said, extending the paper toward Barron with trembling hands. "You need to see this." Barron took the crumpled note carefully, his heart pounding as he unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, and the words were smudged in places, as though they had been written through tears. "To whoever finds me," the note began, "please forgive me. I've lost everything: my husband, my child, my hope. I have nothing left to live for. I've tried. I really tried, but I can't go on anymore." Barron's chest tightened as he read the heartbreaking plea. His eyes darted back to the woman, who stood there trembling, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Did you know about this?" Barron asked, turning to the officer, his voice low but steady. The officer's face flushed, his rigid posture faltering. "It's not what you think," he mumbled, avoiding Barron's eyes. "What is it, then?" Barron pressed, holding up the note. "Because it looks like she's in serious trouble." The woman let out a choked sob, drawing Barron's attention back to her. He stepped closer, his tone softening. "Ma'am, can you tell me what's going on? I want to help." She shook her head, her shoulders trembling. "It doesn't matter," she whispered. "It's too late now." "No, it's not," Barron said firmly, his voice steady but kind. "If it were too late, you wouldn't be here asking for help." The officer shifted uncomfortably, running a hand over his face. "She's my sister," he admitted finally, his voice heavy with guilt. Barron blinked, taken aback. The connection between them suddenly made sense. "Your sister?" he echoed, glancing between the two of them. The officer nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I didn't know it had gotten this bad," he muttered. "I thought I was helping her, keeping her busy, giving her space, but I didn't realize." His voice trailed off, thick with regret. The woman let out another sob, and Barron turned to her, his expression resolute. "You're not alone," he said gently. "We're here now, and we'll figure this out together." As the tension in the air began to lift, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The woman's desperation, the officer's defensiveness, and Barron's refusal to walk away together, they created a moment that would change all of their lives. Barron stood silently, the crumpled note trembling slightly in his hands as he reread the heartbreaking words. Each sentence painted a vivid picture of the woman's despair, a life unraveled by loss and pain. Her husband, gone in a tragic accident. Her child, taken too soon by a cruel illness. And now, the crushing weight of financial ruin had left her with nothing but isolation and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The woman's trembling voice broke the silence. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I could handle it on my own. But I can't. I just can't anymore." Barron turned to her, his expression filled with compassion. "You're not alone," he said softly. You don't have to face this by yourself. Before he could say more, the officer stepped forward, his face flushed with a mix of anger and guilt. She's not alone, he snapped defensively. I've been trying to help her. She's my sister, for God's sake. The revelation startled Barron. He glanced between the officer and the woman, piecing together their connection. Your sister, he asked, his voice calm but firm. Yes, the officer admitted, avoiding his sister's tearful gaze. I've been trying to keep her going. I thought if I kept her busy, gave her some space, she'd get better. I didn't know it had gotten this bad. The woman let out a bitter laugh, her voice shaking with emotion. You didn't know, she said, her words sharp despite her fragile state. How could you? You were never there. You thought keeping me busy would fix everything, but all it did was make me feel more invisible. The officer's shoulders sagged, her words cutting deep. I didn't know what else to do, he said, his voice quieter now. I didn't have the answers, and I didn't want to make things worse. Barron stepped between them, his calm presence grounding the emotional storm brewing around them. It's clear you both care about each other, he said gently. But caring isn't always enough. Sometimes, we have to show up, even when we don't know what to say or do. The officer looked at Barron, his defenses cracking under the weight of his sister's pain. You don't understand, he muttered. I didn't know how to help her. I thought I was doing the right thing. Barron's voice remained steady. None of us have all the answers, he said. But the worst thing we can do is nothing. Being there, even when it's uncomfortable or messy, is what makes the difference. The woman's tears flowed freely now, her voice breaking as she spoke. I've felt so alone, she confessed, her words barely above a whisper. After losing my husband and Noah, I didn't think I had anything left to live for. And every time I reached out, it felt like I was just bothering people. The officer's head dropped, his guilt palpable. You weren't bothering me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't know how to be there for you. Barron placed a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder. Sometimes, it's not about knowing what to do, he said. It's about being present. You've both been through so much, and it's okay to admit you need help. That's not a weakness, it's courage. The woman looked up at her brother, her eyes searching his face. I didn't want to burden you, she said, her voice trembling. You're my sister, the officer said, his voice breaking. You're never a burden. For a moment, the three of them stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The tension that had once filled the air began to lift, replaced by the first flicker of hope. Barron broke the silence, his tone gentle but resolute. This isn't something that will be fixed overnight, he said. But it's not too late to start. You've both taken the first step by being here, by listening to each other. The woman nodded slowly, her tears subsiding as she took a deep, shuddering breath. The officer reached out hesitantly, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Barron knew that while the road ahead for these siblings wouldn't be easy, they had taken the first step toward healing. And in that moment, the power of connection and understanding shone brighter than ever. Barron's voice broke the heavy silence, his tone calm yet filled with purpose. I understand what it feels like to be judged before anyone even knows you, he began, looking between the woman and the officer. The woman raised her tear-streaked face, her eyes searching his, while the officer, still visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight. I've spent most of my life under a microscope, Barron continued. People assume they know everything about me because of my name, my family, or the life they think I live. But the truth is, they don't. And that's okay. What matters is how I choose to respond. His words carried weight, not because they were dramatic but because they were honest. The woman wiped her face with trembling hands, a small flicker of curiosity softening her expression. Barron turned to the officer. "You're her brother," he said gently. "You're supposed to be her safe place. But I get it's hard. You don't always know what to say or how to help. I've felt that way, too, with people I care about." The officer's face tightened, his guilt clear. "I thought I was doing what she needed," he said, his voice quieter now. "I thought giving her space would help her heal." "And sometimes space is good," Barron agreed. "But sometimes, people need to know you're there, even if you don't have the answers. Just being present can make all the difference." The woman's voice, though small, carried an undeniable weight. "I thought I was bothering you," she admitted, glancing at her brother. "I didn't want to make things harder for you." "You're my sister," the officer said, his voice cracking. "You've never been a burden, Claire. I just didn't know how to help." Barron took a step closer, his presence steady and reassuring. "Neither of you is to blame," he said firmly. "Grief doesn't come with a guidebook. It's messy, and it hurts, but the fact that you're both here, willing to talk, means you still have each other." The officer nodded, his eyes glistening. "I just want to make things right," he said. "Then let's start now," Barron said, his tone encouraging. "The first step is taking her somewhere safe, where she can rest and get the support she needs." He turned to the woman, his gaze kind but determined. "There's no shame in asking for help. It's the bravest thing you can do." Her lip trembled, but she managed a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Together, the three of them made their way toward the officer's car. Barron stayed close, ensuring the woman felt supported. As they settled her in, Barron's calm leadership eased the tension that had gripped them all. As they prepared to leave, the woman looked up at Barron, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. Barron smiled, his own emotions tempered by the knowledge that this was just the beginning of her healing. "We're all in this together," he said simply. As Barron helped the woman into the car, the tension that had gripped the roadside began to dissipate. The officer, still visibly shaken, moved to the driver's seat, his sister now sitting safely in the back. Barron stepped back, watching as the car pulled away toward the nearest hospital. His heart felt heavy, but there was also a quiet sense of purpose. He had done what he could. Unbeknownst to him, a passerby had been standing nearby, quietly capturing the entire exchange on their phone. The kindness, composure, and empathy Barron had shown didn't go unnoticed. The stranger, deeply moved by what they had witnessed, decided to share the story on social media later that evening. The post read, "Today, I saw something extraordinary on the highway. A young man, Barron Trump, stepped in to help a woman in need when no one else would. He listened, showed compassion, and reminded us all that true leadership isn't about power, it's about humanity." Within hours, the video began to spread like wildfire. Comments flooded in from people around the world, each adding their own perspective on what the moment represented. This is the kind of news we need to see more of. Empathy changes lives. Barron Trump is proving that kindness transcends politics or privilege. We could all learn from this. In a world so divided, this is a reminder of what really matters: being there for one another. News outlets quickly picked up the story, framing it as an example of quiet heroism. Interviews and analysis followed, with commentators praising Barron's humility and willingness to step out of his comfort zone to help a stranger. But beyond the viral sensation, something deeper began to happen. People started sharing their own stories of stepping up for others. Acts of kindness multiplied, from neighbors helping one another to strangers reaching out with compassion. For Barron, the attention wasn't the goal. When asked about the incident in a brief interview, he simply said, "It was never about recognition. It was about doing the right thing. We all have the ability to make a difference, we just have to choose to." The story continued to ripple through social media and conversations, inspiring a quiet movement of empathy that reminded the world of a simple truth: kindness is powerful. As Barron drove away from the scene, the hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the quiet. The weight of the encounter lingered in his mind. He replayed the woman's trembling words, the officer's guilt, and the raw emotions they had all shared. For a moment, he glanced at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. Despite the calm exterior he had maintained, he felt deeply moved by what had just unfolded. Barron wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but he couldn't help but feel grateful for being in the right place at the right time. It wasn't much, he murmured to himself, but sometimes, even small actions can make a difference. Meanwhile, the officer and his sister began their own journey toward healing. As they arrived at the hospital, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that while the road ahead would be long, they had taken the first steps together. The officer, once reluctant to confront the depth of his sister's pain, now vowed to be present for her in ways he hadn't before. In the following days, they began rebuilding their relationship with simple acts of trust and open conversations. The bond they shared as family, though strained, had been reignited by Barron's gentle insistence that it's never too late to try. As Barron pulled into his driveway that evening, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He stepped out of his car and gazed at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. He thought about the strangers he had met that day and the invisible struggles so many people carry. With a deep breath, he reflected, sometimes, it only takes one act of kindness to change the course of someone's life and remind us all of our shared humanity.